for September that I have prepared. So hopefully by the end of this week, I will email you all the calendar and get the rooms reserved and everything. So I'm working on that. Good news, we interviewed our prospective docents. We have 22 excellent candidates who accepted our offer, and they will be taking our professional development classes Thursday evenings through the end of January, ideally able to start giving tours with the rest of you by April. So it's very exciting, 22 new docents. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff so we can get started. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I've been having sinus trouble the past few days, so my voice might get a little creaky as we go on. But so we're going to talk about this year's CMA Thurber House Graphic Novelist Residency. This year's artist is Ronald Wimberly. That's a picture of him there that was used for a Dr. Pepper promotion. I just wanted to show you what a cool guy he is. He's cool. So this is the 5th annual Graphic Novelist Residency Program. And just to remind you of the previous 4 artists, we had Paul Hornschmeyer, Ed Piskor, Lily Carre, and Eleanor Davis, and then Ronald Wimberly this year. So one of the things that we're trying to do with the selection process of artists is to reflect the kind of emerging reality of the comics world, which is that there's quite a lot of diversity among the artists, especially the younger artists that are coming up. And, for example, CCAD just announced their new comics program over there, and that's a majority of women artists that are in that program, which is notable because it's the comics industry traditionally has been really heavily dominated by white artists and by male artists. And so while the artists coming up, we're seeing a lot more diversity, there is still some problems with diversity in the editorial and executive levels of the comics industry, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. So the Graphic Novelist Residency, it's a partnership, of course, with Thurber House. The highlight for us is the exhibition at CMA that's part of the residency. The artist will actually be here in Columbus and live at Thurber House for 3 weeks. And during that time, the artist will engage in public programming, and we'll be meeting some of the local artists, and we'll kind of introduce them to the community. So I just want to remind everyone why we do the residency and what do we want out of it as an institution. A big part of it is to reinforce our role in the Columbus comics scene. Columbus, over the past few years, has really become kind of a hub, a Midwestern kind of headquarters for comics study and comics creation. Of course, Jeff Smith, the creator of Bone, lives here in Columbus and has pursued his entire career while living here in Columbus. Just recently, a journalist named Tom Spurgeon relocated to Columbus. Actually, it's been a couple years now that he's lived here. But he's the best-known journalist. He's a comics critic, but mainly he just covers the industry, and he's very well connected, and he lives here in Columbus. And of course, we've got the Billy Ireland Cartoon Museum and Library over on the OSU campus, which is really an international destination for comics study. Again, this is a collaborative program, so one of the things that we want to do with this program is to reinforce our relationship with Thurber House and with CXC, which is a festival I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And then comics is a good way, the kinds of comic artists that we select for this program are all sort of transdisciplinary, or they approach comics in a way that is interesting and maybe they often they're artists who work in a lot of different areas, and comics is one of the art forms that they pursue. We try to communicate the Center for Creativity values and the kind of creative thinking and thinking like an artist. All of that stuff is wrapped up in the graphic novelist residency exhibition that we do. So this year, this is the first year that we synced up the residency program with this festival, CXC, Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, and that's a new comics and cartooning festival that had kind of a pilot launch last year in a scaled down kind of way. This year is the first year that they've gone full scale with it. The festival was founded by Jeff Smith and Tom Spurgeon and Lucy Caswell. Lucy Caswell was the founder of the Billy Ireland Museum and Library over at OSU. And that festival is really about the art form, and it's about the artists who create comics and animation and editorial cartoons. And that distinguishes it from, say, the Wizard World or San Diego Comic-Con or some of the other big Comic-Cons that you might have seen on the news, where it's all about the properties. It's all about, the Avengers or Superman, or the next, the video games that are coming out based on comic characters. So that's really about those Comic-Cons are really about the properties, the intellectual properties and the brands, and not so much about the artists. But this CXC really does focus in on the artists and the art form. And SoulCon is congruent with CXC, and it's the Brown Black Comics Expo. So that's a small scale comics expo that's hosted on the OSU campus that focuses on artists who are people of color. And last year again was its first year. This year, SoulCon has kind of is merging with CXC for Saturday and Sunday. So CXC, the ideal for CXC is that it happens all over the city, and so there would be a weekend or half of a week that's where the Columbus, everywhere you go, there's comics stuff happening. And this year we're starting that with, the first day of programming is on the OSU campus, focused on the Billy Ireland Museum, and then Saturday and Sunday. Well, Saturday's. It's a big artists expo that takes place at the main library, and then Sunday that takes place again also. But then we have two programs that happen here at the museum, including Ronald Wimberly's public interview. So this first year the CXC festival extends from the OSU campus basically down High Street, to us, and hopefully we'll get some of the Short North galleries to get in on this. And then the SoulCon artists will join CXC at the main library on Saturday and Sunday. So Ronald is kind of serving, we have a table at the Artists Expo at CXC, and we're hosting Ronald there, but he's also representing SoulCon. So what do we want the visitors to get out of the exhibition? Number one, we want visitors to recognize comics as a form of art that Ronald Wimberly explores. In the exhibition, we have illustrations that he's done, graphic design, T-shirts that he's designed. Several areas of his practice are represented, and then with special emphasis on comics. And we want visitors to think about issues of racism and racial representation that are brought up in Wimberly's work. His comics, he commonly engages with social issues, not always racism and racial representation, but issues of class and gentrification and urban life, violence. So even when he's writing stories that are kind of sci-fi inflected, or they're adventure stories, or they're martial arts action stories, underneath all that, there are some real social issues that he's grappling with. And we want visitors to consider the value of sampling and remixing to the creative process. And we'll look in depth at some examples of artwork that Ronald created by taking elements of different different cultures, really, and sort of breaking them down, analyzing them, finding the parallels between them, and juxtapositions, and sort of recombining that into something new. And the best example of that remixing process, and probably the most important area of the exhibition, is dedicated to this book, which is it's called Prince of Cats. And this was a book that was published originally in 2012, and it was not handled by the publisher very well. It wasn't promoted very well, and it didn't get the attention that it deserved. I always felt that way. I read it. I probably read it 6 months or so after it came out, and I thought it was one of the best comics that I had read that year. But it was a couple of years before I ever talked to anybody else who had read it, and that includes, people who are really dedicated to finding the best comics out there, and they had never heard of this. I just found it by chance in the main library, which is kind of a testament to how nice our main library is about keeping their comics collection up to date. But so Prince of Cats is Ronald Wimberly's kind of deconstruction, or his breaking down and retelling of Romeo and Juliet, which of course is something that's a thing that people do, right? West Side Story is kind of a reinterpretation of Romeo and Juliet, but set among gangs in New York. And then on the right, that's Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which, so instead of the Montagues and Capulets fighting with swords, they're fighting with pistols. And it's kind of like a South Beach, Miami gang warfare kind of thing. So Ronald Wimberly's take on Romeo and Juliet is similar to West Side Story in that it's about rival gangs in New York. The funny thing, though, so this is kind of his imaginary fantasy sci-fi version of New York, specifically Brooklyn, in the early 80s, kind of at the dawn of hip-hop as a cultural movement. But his gangs, they fight with swords the way the Montagues and Capulets would have in the original Romeo and Juliet. And the language, the dialogue that the characters speak is this kind of mix that Ronald came up with. It's the mix of Elizabethan English, sometimes actual quotes from Romeo and Juliet, mixed with the kind of street slang that you would have heard in 1983 in Brooklyn, and lyrics from rap songs. There's just tons of references to 80s pop culture, R&B songs, and hip hop, and also it's very heavily influenced by Japanese comics and Japanese martial arts movies. So that's the way a page would look in the book, right? It's in color. We're not exhibiting the colored pages. We're exhibiting his original drawings. So a lot of these, would appear unfinished, and you see the kind of physical process that he goes through in drawing these pages, and you'll see his thinking on the page in a lot of cases. You'll see notes that he's made to himself, or in the margins there may be a place where he's redrawn a face to try to get a better feel for the expression, something like that. Now here we're going to get into what I think makes one of the things that makes Prince of Cats really special, and that's the language and this remixing of the language. So it's about to get real text heavy here for a little bit, but I hope you'll stick with it because it is pretty interesting. But here, this is a quote from Ronald about why. Okay, so the important thing about Prince of Cats is that it's his retelling of Romeo and Juliet, but it focuses on the character of Tybalt rather than Romeo. Romeo's in it, the book, but the story is really focused on Tybalt, who is this kind of reckless, self-destructive character that ends up getting killed over honor, which Ronald points out here in the third line of this quote, that honor and ego is really kind of the same thing, especially among street gangs. Okay, so here's where things get a little text heavy. You don't have to read all this. I just want to point out. So on the left, we've got Shakespeare's prologue from Romeo and Juliet. And then on the right is Ronald Wimberly's prologue to Prince of Cats. And you can see that the rhythms of the language are similar, that there are, in fact, quotes. You know, he's sampled Shakespeare's prologue directly for a couple of lines. But then there's obvious lines that are not from Shakespeare and that are either Ronald's original language or sampled from somewhere else. But he's drawn this parallel between rival. So in Romeo and Juliet, you've got these, youths that are energetic, loyal, more violent than they should be, reckless. They fall in love a little too hard, and they fight all the time, right? There's a lot of fighting in Romeo and Juliet. So Ronald saw that and saw that his experience growing up and being a teenager in New York, there was a lot of similarities between what he saw on the streets then and what was in Romeo and Juliet. So this is actually essentially what you see here is going to be on the wall in part of the exhibition, actually, like that. So that visitors, we make it explicit to visitors that Ronald Wimberly's original prologue, it samples Notorious B.I.G., the intro to the song Things Done Changed is how we start out. And then we get into the direct sample from Shakespeare. And then it ends with another sample from Langston Hughes in his poem Harlem, with that, the American dream deferred line is a direct reference to that. So we make this very explicit in the exhibition for the visitors. And then we also have a connector that they can do there, a hands-on activity where we've taken a lot of excerpts from Shakespeare plays and a couple of sonnets, and then a lot of rap lyrics from a group of rappers that would probably be considered like the best of all time, like the most lyrically advanced kind of rappers throughout the history of rap. And we're inviting visitors to find the connections between those, chop it up, and kind of remix their own poems out of the language of Shakespeare and then the various rappers that we've got. So what's funny is, I'm curious what you guys think. If you had that task, if you're thinking of what are some connections between Shakespeare, like, whatever Shakespeare stories you might be familiar with, and then whatever rap you might be familiar with, your ideas about rap, and like where do you think those would cross over? Because we're talking about separation, hundreds of years and completely different cultures, but where would the overlaps be? I kind of discovered this, as I was doing it, yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know that much about Hamilton, but I know it's a thing. Yeah.
I think it might be the rhythms that Shakespeare used.
Yeah.
I was Elizabethan nature, so this is very interesting to me. But and the rhythm of his poetry, which probably can be compared to the rhythm of the rap.
No doubt. Yeah, for sure. So formally, the connections are really clear with the rhyme schemes and the iambic pentameter and so definitely just formally on the surface, those connections are really very clear. And then thematically, what I ended up finding.
Is it like honor?
Like honor. Basically, honor and respect, long-standing feuds, revenge, and just violence, sorrow, nostalgia, time passing, the death of your friends. And so thematically, there was just tons of this stuff that rappers and Shakespeare talk about. Or Shakespeare's characters, really, they're talking about this all the time. So I hope that connector, I hope that people do some interesting stuff, because the potential's there. But it's kind of, it's a prototype. So we're gonna put it out. We're gonna see how the visitors do and keep an eye on how much they're engaging with it and what the results are like. And then, of course, we'll readjust if we need to. So this is a fun one. This is a sequence where two characters are trading. They're doing the dozens. So they're trading insults, which you might know, like snaps, like or roasting, where basically like your mama jokes, right? Like your mama's so fat, whatever. But that's like your mama jokes is just one like segment of it. But like that whole routine and that whole culture of like playfully insulting people back and forth there's so many other like forms that it takes. It's been going on for hundreds of years, right? In a lot of in many black communities, it's something that's just like kids grow up learning how to do it, and the more creative you are, that's the winner, right? So if there's a battle, whoever's the most creative, comes up with the most surprising and original insults is the winner of that battle. So in this case, there's two characters they're doing that. They're doing the dozens, but the language is styled, as this kind of Elizabethan language.
Jeff, do you mind reading it for those of us who are having trouble? Sorry.
Sure. I feel like I'm with this line about the glasses. I'm a little like. Thy glasses are prescription, and so thick, squinting, thou couldst see the back of thine own head, and yet thine hairlines still art so crooked, thy barber must be thine own cross-eyed mama. And then the other character, Samson, says, "It's like that, huh?" So then he goes in on her, and it's just just brutally insults her. But it's hilarious. It's great. Here's a scene that takes place in the barber shop, and again, it's pretty. Here, I know what it says, so I think I can read it. It's a little blurry. So the barber's saying, "More children pierced over childish bullshit," and then this is Samson and Gregory are these two characters, and Gregory says, "Not bullshit, barber, but the beef of our Lord. Verily, cousin, for our Lord I'd cut beef." So it's a pun on beef, right? So cutting beef, but of course a beef is would be like a long-standing grudge that two people have for each other is beef. And then that's Tybalt getting his hair cut. He says, "Cousin, thy cuts are more rare than well done. Thou hast a beef tongue yet unseasoned." So he's making fun of his. He's making fun of his skill with a sword, which is very important to these guys, and he's making fun of his lack of skill with the insults. And I don't know if I can read this. Well, this last line by Gregory here continues that kind of the pun between the beef, the grudge, and then slicing beef. And meaning, getting in a sword fight to settle that grudge. So there's all the kind of puns that Shakespeare's famous for, the dirty jokes, or not dirty jokes, but like the bawdy kind of sense of humor that Shakespeare's famous for. Ronald sometimes he'll sample that and he'll just lift it and put it directly into his comic. But then also with all of his original dialogue, he takes the same puns and the same kind of witty wordplay and just runs with it. So that's kind of where the meat of the book is. But it's in the language. So you'll see in the exhibition there's we've got these big blocks of text everywhere, which normally which we really try to avoid that because we know visitors don't, their eyes will just bounce right off of a big wall of text. But in this case, I just felt like it's so important, and it's so interesting and original and kind of unique to Ronald Wimberly's work that I just had to make sure that it was visible. And of course, the book itself will be in the exhibition so that folks will be able to flip through. And one thing I want to mention is anytime I typed out the text, if I was quoting from Ronald Wimberly's book or from the rap lyrics, anytime I was typing the text to put up on the wall for the visitor to see, I basically censored it, right, which I hate doing, but I would use the kind of asterisks to kind of like obscure, like the way the radio, would like bleep out a word, something like that. And I'm not crazy about it. Ronald's not crazy about it, but after I talked to some folks here at the museum, we figured that would probably be the best move. In the book, you can see his unedited book, in the exhibition, and you can read it for yourself, uncensored. But was there a question? Yeah, I define, so like in the labels, like when I say, in the label for this work, I'll say, whatever, in this scene, 2 characters are doing the dozens. And then in parentheses, I'll have there's like a short definition of what that means. But I don't define every term, but like with something like that, people have all different kinds of backgrounds, and you don't know who's going to know what that means or who isn't. So we tried to define that. It's the trading of those insults. Yeah. Yeah. Now I hear kids talk about roasting more. Like those kids' grandparents were doing the dozens, right? But the kids and then now, and I'm just talking about like what I hear from kids, and then also, like this stuff's huge on like YouTube and Instagram, videos of people roasting each other.
There's also celebrity roast. It's not,
Well, yeah, but this is, yeah, but it's like
competition when you're talking about celebrity roasters.
Yeah, but it's still that kind of like, who can come up with the funniest, most creative insult? Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Jeff, do you have any parenthetical definitions of some of the Elizabethan terms that people might not be familiar with?
I don't think I got into that really. I just used like Elizabethan or Shakespearean. I think in the text I just say Shakespearean. I think I avoided the word Elizabethan.
In terms of some of the language that might be lifted from the original Shakespeare that might be withhold.
No. Honestly, there was just like, there's too much. There's so much obscure. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the other influences that went into Prince of Cats. So we talked about Shakespeare. We talked about kind of the street gang culture in 80s New York. Also, Basquiat. Basquiat graffiti shows up on the walls of the comic. You can see here, this is a page where Ronald is working on some Basquiat-styled graffiti, and also, working on some of the Japanese language graffiti that he has on the wall. Oh, that's that. Okay, so Jean-Michel Basquiat is an artist who was very hot in the 80s, and he's one of the best. I'd call him one of the best Black American artists that the country's ever produced. But he was a figure in the 80s kind of downtown scene of artists and musicians and poets that were all very, very cool. And he hung out with Warhol and did collaborative work with Warhol. And this is just kind of like just to give you an idea of how Ronald would sample things like that. Just to add a flavor to it, right? It's not like critical to the story, but they're little Easter eggs, right? For a reader who is familiar with this stuff, like it triggers something in their mind, and it helps create kind of like a mood for the whole work. Now, another big influence on Prince of Cats is a Japanese comic and animated film called Akira. So this is an image from the Japanese movie Akira, which is For fans of Japanese animation, especially in America, that movie's very, very important. That was like the first kind of serious, adult-oriented Japanese animation that got a wide release in America. It came out in the early 90s. I think it came through, I saw it in the theater in Atlanta. I think that was 92, maybe 91. But it made a huge impact on anybody. And by the way, Ronald's 36 years old, I think. Just to give you an idea of, how old he was when this movie came out. And this is an image from the comic, the Japanese comic that Akira was based on. Okay, so two things here. This jacket, this red leather jacket with a pill on the back, that's sort of like a very iconic image from Akira. And I know this is hard to see in this slide, but an important character in Prince of Cats has that same pill design on the back of his jacket. And then, again, the pill shows up here. One of the characters, this is Speed, and this character is taking this pill, and Ronald has a character kind of reenact the exact scene. So anybody who's familiar with Akira is going to see that, and like immediately they'll see where Ronald's coming from, right? This isn't. I'm just giving you some information about Ronald. This stuff isn't in the exhibition. I mean, we don't talk about Akira in the exhibition. Another huge influence on Ronald, and even bigger than the Japanese animation, I'd say it's the Japanese samurai and gangster movies. I don't know if I have to say too much about that, but Ronald uses a lot of the design and the kind of the rhythms of samurai movies, the historical Japanese samurai movies like Yojimbo and Zatoichi especially, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So you'll see Japanese culture popping up again and again in Ronald's work. This is the work on the left is a painting, and the one on the right is a silkscreen print. And Ronald's kind of alter ego, and the name that he uses on the internet is this symbol, which you pronounce D pi, just the letter D and then the pi symbol. And then he'll represent himself often as a tengu, and tengu is this mask here with the long nose, and that is a tengu is kind of a dog, like a mountain demon that has its roots in ancient Shinto religion. This is the god of the tengu. His name's Shojobo, which you'll see here, Sojobo. The title of this piece is Sojobo Got a Haircut. And then the one on the left is called, he calls this one Sambo Joe. So you've got the tengu, and he directly referenced Little Black Sambo, which of course is the racist caricature that was found in old children's books. And then also with the pose of the head, he's referencing these, the posters that you commonly find in black barbershops that advertise some of the varieties of haircut that you can get. So you can see here, Ronald. I mean, this is Ronald's thing, right? He's taking three kind of cultural elements that are very unrelated, but then he's finding a way to connect all those and finding the parallels between them. So, excuse me. Sojobo, the tengu, is a trickster character. Mythologically, he's a trickster god, able to get into trouble and get back out of trouble, through using his wits. That's where Little Black Sambo is a very similar character, in that he gets into trouble and then escapes by tricking the tiger or somehow using his wits to get out of trouble. Now, of course, Little Black Sambo is a really loaded, troublesome image. It's a racist caricature. I'm pretty sure that's the original version of Little Black Sambo. There are new editions that followed that original edition where the offensive racism of the way that they depict that character gets worse and worse and worse. Of course, now no edition of that book. I mean, they changed the title. I can't remember what the title of it is. But the story is basically told over and over. The story is still told in children's books, but it's been kind of wiped clean of its racist content as much as possible. But Ronald will go back in history, and he wants to confront that racist imagery really directly, and not just confront it, but somehow reclaim it. So he's combined this. He's figured out a way to give this image, which is almost like a blackface kind of caricature, a way to kind of reclaim that for himself as an image of power, and to reclaim it as the image of a trickster god. So we keep seeing this Japanese influence pop up, especially in this comic, which he's producing currently, but also it was the second comic. It's a series, and the first time he ever drew it he was still in school. It was the second comic he had ever drawn, and it's called Gratuitous Ninja. And it's basically just fight comics, right? So it's ninjas running around in New York. It takes place in the same world that Prince of Cats takes place in, but without the Shakespearean dialogue. But it's a early 80s New York where street gangs are trained in martial arts and fight with swords, rather than with their fists or with guns. And so, he talks about what attracted him to ninja and why does he use ninja in his comics. And he sees them as unstoppable, shrewd, subversive power. So, again, you see that idea of a trickster, someone who can sneak around undetected. Nobody knows their true intentions, but are very resourceful and witty. Now, it's not just a fight comic. It's not just about showing bodies in action, but it's about real issues of community, urban planning, the prison industrial complex, cultural appropriation, cultural commodification, and identity framed in the language of manga or Japanese comics. Manga is just the word for Japanese comics. Essentially, that's the most useful definition of manga. So, with Prince of Cats and Gratuitous Ninja, I think both of those comics have an immediate kind of appeal because the characters look cool, they got cool clothes, the fighting is it's action packed, and it kind of has this immediate pop appeal, but it isn't shallow work, and he is really he's packing these stories with real issues and cultural commentary, and he's asking a lot of questions about urban culture and about gentrification and all kinds of things. Now, this comic, Gratuitous Ninja, he's producing that specifically for the internet. So if you wanted to read that comic, you'd have to have the particular app, and so that you could read it on your iPad or phone. So those are some of his personal works that he's doing for himself, but he has worked in the industry. He worked for Marvel Comics for a while, and what we're exhibiting is the original drawing that was colored and then used for a cover of an Avengers comic, and he styled that. It says Thanos Comes to Harlem, so he styled it after the old blaxploitation films, specifically Cotton Comes to Harlem in this case. So he's drawn this kind of like a 70s blaxploitation version of this character, Luke Cage. But, all that's not, essentially this is just, it's just a cool image, right? I mean, like when we talk about it out in the hallway, it's just to point out that Ronald Wimberly has worked in the superhero industry, because that becomes very important later. And he did some comics, he did some X-Men comics. I know that's hard to see, but it's an ink drawing on paper. So he did that for a couple of years, and he doesn't do it anymore. And one of the reasons is he talks about it in this comic, Lighten Up, which here you're seeing 4 panels from a 26-panel comic that was originally produced online and is probably his best-known work. It's this 26-panel comic that he published online. That's what he's most well known for. And we took that comic and printed all the images on 8.5 by 8.5 square panels, and that's installed. Has anyone already seen it out there in the hallway, the Lighten Up comic? So what this comic is about is when Ronald was working on X-Men, the Marvel superhero comic, he was asked by his editor to lighten the skin tone of one of the characters that he had drawn. And his response was, he wrote back to them and he said, but I thought that this character was, he had looked up the biography of the character online, and he said, she's supposed to be, I think that he said, black, like one parent was black American, and then the other parent was from Brazil. Like, that's the only information that he had. And then the editor wrote back and said, no, that's changed over the years. I'm told now that she is mixed. This is what the editor said. I'm told now she's mixed Latino and white. So then that just like opened up all these questions in Ronald's mind. Like, well, when you say Latina, what color is that? And like, why did the editor assume that somebody who has been labeled Latina would be one color or another? There's all kinds of colors within that definition of Latina. And then also he was just wondering what was the editor's motivation for lightening the skin tone in the first place? And so he brings up all those questions and answers a few of those questions for himself and expands that thinking into the world of fine art. And it brings up a lot of really interesting things to talk about, and which is exactly what people did. When this comic came out online, it immediately started lots and lots of conversations on social media and on the original site where it was published, where people were talking back and forth and saying, a lot of people were saying, thank you for saying this, thank you for finally pointing this out. And then other people might say, it doesn't seem like that big a deal to me. Like, they just wanted you to change the shade from like, this medium brown to a lighter brown. Like, what's the big deal? And then Ronald would respond. He's won prizes. This was like a prize-winning comic. He's gotten passed around among readers and also professionals. I think a lot of professionals were really happy to see Ronald talking about these issues and bringing the editorial practice out into the open and kind of airing out some of these problems that have been, they've been around in the comics industry for a long, long time, and it's finally now, through social media and through artists like Ronald finally talking about it, some of these issues can be worked out. And what it comes down to for Ronald is that in all his time in the comics industry, he's never had a black editor. So as many, there's more and more black artists coming up, but there's still a barrier between the artists and the editorial staff. And there's still a lot of bias and, maybe unconscious sort of racism that takes place in the editorial process in mainstream comics. Yep.
Jeff, does he consider himself at all political, or do others consider his work
Oh, no, he's very political. Yeah.
So he's very open about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Open, sometimes blunt, and so he studied it. He studied it harder than like just about anybody that I've come across, and it's the kind of thing where I can talk to him for. So I met with him to select the artwork in his studio. So I spent 6 hours with him, and for about 2 weeks after that 6-hour meeting, I'm thinking like, oh, that's what he meant, or like I'm looking up some book that he mentioned in passing, and I'm finding out like what his reference was, and he was on Al Jazeera America did a little news story about diversity in comics, and they invited Max Brooks, who is Mel Brooks' son, but who had just written a comic about black soldiers in World War II, black American soldiers in World War II. G. Willow Wilson, who is an American Muslim woman who writes superhero comics for Marvel, and then Ronald Wimberly. And both Max Brooks and, so this is cable news, right? And they want you to give like short sound bites for all your responses to questions. And Max Brooks and G. Willow Wilson pretty much played along and were given those kind of like TV format short answers. And then every time they came to Ronald, he was like, well, he'd say, well, there's a problem with the premise of your question because you assume this, that. I mean, he just, and he would go into it. He doesn't ramble. Everything is on point and well thought out, and it just doesn't fit cable news at all. But I mean, like when you come to see his public interview, which let me give you that date because I forgot to put it on screen. But I think you'll be really impressed by his answers and how he's very counterintuitive sometimes. Like I made a lot of assumptions. I asked him about some work that he had done, and in a way that assumed that I kind of understood where he was coming from or what his motivation was. And he was very quick to correct me and kind of enlighten me to a completely different way of thinking than what I had assumed. Sunday, October 16, at 2:30 is when Ronald will be interviewed by Jared Gardner. Jared Gardner is he's from OSU in the English department. He's in film and pop culture studies. That will be here, yes. So I'll point out one thing that this is a time where he corrected me. So this was a comic that he produced. It's an editorial comic that he published online, and it's called $1 Million Idea. In the first panel, it says, I can't read. Yeah. Okay. So the first panel is about this cop, Sam Carter, who's convicted on all counts in the Mapleton elk trial. The deputy DA holds an elk antler during the prosecution's closing arguments. Okay, so a cop killed an elk, shot an elk, killed the elk, and was found guilty of wrongly killing this elk. And then the third panel, he says, Ferguson, MO, police officer Darren Wilson, as you all know, was acquitted, was not charged in the killing of Mike Brown. So Ronald's $1 Million Idea is to put elk horns on hoodies so that cops will stop shooting black men. So we have a few of these editorial cartoons that Ronald drew up in the gallery, and I asked him to do a guide by cell, and I said I suggested a question that he could answer for the guide by cell, and the question was, what can you say with an editorial cartoon that you couldn't say with words or by writing an essay or an article? And he wrote back and he said, well, you can't. He said, the cartoon, I can say much more with words than I can with an editorial cartoon. And actually, the reason I do editorial cartoons is because I know that's what white journalists want, and that he's formatting his thought. What he's trying to do with these editorial cartoons is format his thinking into a package that fits the kind of like essentially like a white intellect. And he knows that's what editors want, and so that he's given them what they want. Like he's specifically trying to advance this part of his career, and he knows who the editors are and what they'd want, and so he's trying to package his ideas for them specifically. And he said, he wrote that back to me, and I'm not saying it as well as he did, or as thoughtfully, but he said, so maybe you wouldn't want me to do the guide by cell about that. And I said, no, like, please do that, exactly. Like, say, give us your honest thoughts, because I think that's what visitors would appreciate, rather than just some kind of, like a weak answer to a question that I came up with. So, look out for that one. This should be a pretty interesting guide by cell. This is a project that he's been doing for a couple of years. Again, these are published online in colored versions, but we're showing the original black and white drawings. And it's called, he changes the title here and there, but originally it was called Black History in Their Own Words. And now he's been referring it to Black History / Future in Their Own Words. And so for each panel, he does one panel per day throughout Black History Month each year. And each one is a notable figure in Black history, accompanied by a quote directly from them. And you'll see there's quite a variety, and he's really he's got a broad spectrum of history that he's picking from. I always like to point out, this is George Harriman, the cartoonist that drew Crazy Cat, which a lot of people didn't know that he was black. Actually, when he was alive and working, people didn't know he was black. Sorry, nature is quite queer. So, sorry, what was it?
Are these quotes from the real people, or are they
Yes.
that he's
No. They're quotes from history that those people actually said. Yeah, this is blurry, but sorry about that. But I'll point out. So this is George Harriman, creator of Crazy Cat, Laverne Cox, Lena Horne, Dave Chappelle, James Baldwin, Saul Williams, Spike Lee, Ice Cube. And this one, that's MC Ride from a group called Death Grips. Is that Angela Davis, I think? Oh, yeah? Huh. So Ronald, this is two projects that Ronald has upcoming. Oh, I should mention, okay, so Prince of Cats was published in 2012, kind of mishandled by the publisher, has been out of print for years, which is just absurd. Like, that book has only gained popularity and gained attention over the past few years, and for that book to be out of print it's bananas. And so he took the book, he owned the rights to that book, and he took it to a company called Image Comics, which is a very artist-oriented publisher. Image is not about creating characters like Superman and Batman and Spider-Man that will then go on to be properties and movies and things like that. Image is about giving creators control over the profits and control over the intellectual property of their comics. And so Ronald he's taken Prince of Cats to Image, and they are republishing it, and that should be out in just 1 month. That'll be out, and of course we'll have it in the museum store, but it's being printed larger and it's just better quality, hardback. And so finally that book will get the attention that it deserved back in 2012. Yeah.
on
The editorial stuff is free, and that's at a website called The Nib. That's THENIB.com. Right now, thenib.com is sort of flooded with Trump cartoons, Trump editorial cartoons. But they do great stuff. The Nib is a good site, and they tap really good artists. But you could read the entirety of Lighten Up there, and also you could see some of his editorial cartoons, some of his other editorial cartoons.
And the others, like the
Gratuitous Ninja you would have to pay for.
where'd you get it?
The app is called Stela. It's Stela. And so you would buy I think the app is free, but then you would have to buy the comic, or you'd have to buy a subscription to whatever Stela is producing. So now Ronald Wimberly has started this relationship with Image Comics, and he announced, besides the reprint of Prince of Cats, he's got two other projects coming up, and this one's called Sunset Park, and this is about a neighborhood in Brooklyn being gentrified by literal vampires. So he's taken that idea of rich folks coming into a neighborhood and making it fancy, and made them literal vampires. And this project is called Slave Punk. And if any of you are familiar with the idea of steampunk, which is kind of a retro-futuristic kind of fantasy sci-fi genre where it's the Victorian era, but where steam technology and Victorian era technology has been advanced to the point where you can make you could fly to the moon using steam power, something like that. And he has taken that idea. Ronald has taken that idea and placed it in the American South during slavery. And so we've got the world's greatest inventor, who also is a slave, and he's building flying machines like the one you can just make out up there. Okay, so the fun thing is that so we saw Prince of Cats and Gratuitous Ninja that take place in the same kind of fictional world. And Sunset Park and Slave Punk also take place in that fictional world. So there's so for example, there could be a vampire character who appears in Slave Punk, but then you see that same character hundreds of years later, or 150 years later in Sunset Park. So both of these, we're talking about like vampires. Both of these stories, like Prince of Cats, they've got these surface elements that are very kind of like sci-fi oriented or fantasy or horror. They're pop, right? Like the surfaces are pop, but then underneath that is some real direct, tough engagement with real social issues. We also have some, now we're going to talk about just some fun stuff here. He designs t-shirts occasionally. Like I'll partner up with a streetwear brand and design shirts. The one on the left is for a company called Mishka. And the one on the right, I forget, that was for a Japanese company. But we've got, I think, 7 of his shirt designs up on the wall. This was a poster called Warp D, and it's his sort of reinvention of the Wonder Woman concept. Just cool, This was an album cover. So this is what you're looking at here is two LPs, right? It was a double LP for this artist Shashu, and so we'll have both of those record covers on the wall. This was a box set that he designed for Criterion Collection, which is a very well-known kind of DVD packager that produces a lot of the best, the very high quality DVD packages. And so this is, however many Zatoichi films, 20-something. So Zatoichi is a blind swordsman that starred in a whole series of films in Japan. He was a swordsman and a gambler. So Ronald designed the outside packaging, the cover of the booklet, and then he did a bunch of sketches that appear on the discs, which you can see some of these quick kind of Sumi ink style sketches he did. All right, this is the thing that you gotta stick with me, because if you're giving a tour to anyone under the age of like 25, this is gonna mean a whole lot to them, and it'll probably mean nothing to you. But you should know why it's a big deal. Does anybody know Attack on Titan? Is anybody familiar with that? Attack on Titan. This is the title here. This is Attack on Titan is it's a Japanese media property. So it's comics, it's a cartoon series, it's live action films, video games, anything you can think of, and it's probably the most popular or most well known kind of Japanese pop culture property, other than maybe like Pokemon, right? It's huge, and again, there's a bad pun. But so what it's about is these giant like humanoid creatures that are constantly attacking humans, and the humans have this walled-off city, and these titans keep attacking the city, and they eat people. They're like cannibalistic. And it's just huge. It's huge. So the Japanese publisher of Attack on Titan comics, Kodansha is the name of that company, commissioned, I think, about a dozen American artists to do their own Attack on Titan comics. And Ronald Wimberly was one of the artists that was commissioned for that. And we have his entire Attack on Titan story up on the wall. And it hasn't been published yet, so we've got a sneak peek. And also, we have it on the wall unedited and uncensored, which is not the way it will appear in Kodansha's anthology comic that features his work. So, like I said, this is going to be a big deal, especially like a high school age group. Is going to be really excited to find out that Ronald Wimberly did some work on Attack on Titan. It's a weird story, too. It's really interesting. You can read the whole thing on the wall. Yeah, it's everything you can think of. Except like an airline. They don't have an airline yet, but like potato chips. You could buy Attack on Titan potato chips. There's a little bit more of it. Here's something fun. So Ronald designed his Titans to look really weird and disturbing, which is the idea. And what's weirder or more disturbing than Donald Trump? See that? Can you guys see that? Right there. And then this is another, this is a short comic that we've got on the wall where you can read the entire story. It's Ronald's, I'm just showing it to you to show that again, he's sampling and remixing here. So this story, it's called Africa with a question mark. And he took the intro sequence to a French movie by Jean-Luc Godard called Alphaville, and kind of retold that in a comics form, but then of course recast, a black character in place of the white character that was originally there, and of course change the dialogue and things like that. But you can see he's got, you can see that he is retelling this French movie, but then he's got like soul records in the jukebox. And then here we've got, he asked the woman that he's with to hold 2 cans of Campbell's soup over his head, and then shoots him with the pop gun, right? And you get that Warhol like doubling. And then he's reading, I can't remember what the book is. He's reading like this is like a French criticism of colonialism. And he's reading it upside down. So it's like, it's the way that Ronald works, where there's so much packed into it that it's hard to even like keep up with the references. But then also he just makes everything look really cool. So we've been really kind of lucky, but I would say more thoughtful than lucky about selecting artists for this residency program that we think are their career is about to really blow up, and they're about to get a lot more attention than they had been getting in the past. So with Ed Piskor, who was our second year, he was working on Hip Hop Family Tree when we had him here, and that was just at that time that was just being serialized on a website, and within a year, that book he had started publishing the book in hardback, and it was a New York Times bestseller, and he's huge right now. Eleanor Davis also, I think, is an artist who started getting more and more attention, not because of our residency, but after we had her. And I think the same as I think Ronald's in that same line. When Prince of Cats gets republished in early October, it's going to be on a lot of people's best of the year list, and we'll win awards, I'm sure. So did anyone have any questions, or that's all the slides that I have, so we can go back and talk about something, or?
I'm assuming with all the unpublished and original sketch, no photographs, nobody taking pictures of this exhibit?
Are there photographs there's no photographs in the exhibition. Oh, yeah, no, you can take pictures.
I was wondering if people wanted to take pictures of this exhibit.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Perhaps I missed something, but Ronald, what's his age? Is he a New Yorker? Where did he school?
I know he lived in D.C., I think, when he was real young, but really grew up in New York. He's 30. Let's see. I think he was born in 79, and he went to Pratt, but didn't graduate. But when I say he didn't graduate, I think he had it was something like he was so close to graduation that he might as well, he just decided he didn't want to for some reason, because he's punk. Ronald's if he's punk. He's against the grain, and when I say punk, I mean he's not a punk. What I mean is he has a punk attitude, meaning punk culture, punk music, punk writing, and he's suspicious of authority, for sure. Suspicious of power and authority. Yeah. Thurber House's involvement. Okay, so the selection of the artist really. The process is that there's like Jeff Smith, all of the previous residents, Caitlin McGurk from the Billy Ireland Museum, Tom Spurgeon now, and then Jared Gardner. We all just sort of talk to each other over email and maybe meet a couple of times, and everyone kind of pitches their short list of artists that they think would be good for the residency, and then we all kind of just come to a consensus agreement about who we're going to select. Now, so Thurber House isn't directly involved with that selection process, but it's always on my mind, you know. And so with Ronald Wimberly, one of the things that really motivated me to push for him was that I knew that the way he plays with language would be really interesting to Thurber House. And then, of course, Ronald is going to live at Thurber House for 3 weeks, and he's going to participate in their Young Writers Workshop, and maybe another program. But Thurber House isn't directly involved with the exhibition here or with the selection process. Uh-huh. It is a challenge. A lot of this work is challenging. I would also, I've only been showing you like little segments here and there, but if you could sit down with the entire book, you would see that all of those references and all the complex ideas, they're sort of packaged into a story that just like moves right along and is, the story of Romeo and Juliet, actually what happens, that's really simple, right? And so you could read Prince of Cats and you know that, okay, this guy's Tybalt and Romeo's his rival, and and then you know why he gets in a fight with Romeo at the end and gets killed. All that's, so the story is all there, and it's pretty simple. It's just that I would say it's maybe a little bit challenging, but even more so, it's just rewarding. The deeper that you dig into any of his stories, the more ideas just start coming out, so it's very rewarding. I mean, his Attack on Titan story, there's no reason for that to have any kind of like social commentary, or it could have just been this simple action horror story about these monsters. But he's not going to do that. So I didn't talk about it much, but there's tons of politics and historical references in his Attack on Titan comic. But that's not what, if you're giving a tour to high schoolers, they're not going to care about Bertolt Brecht references, right? What they're going to see is just like totally awesome action sequence. And that's cool. That's fine. I mean, they are totally awesome action sequences. So.
This has high school appeal.
Oh yeah, no,
Teenage appeal.
for sure.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, like this is the thing that like a teenager would get really excited about, most likely. But just the look of his stuff is very, it's very fresh and it looks young. The styling and the way he draws figures and all of that, and just like how his inclusion of characters that look all different kinds of ways, and like that's it's very appealing to young people. Was there another question? Uh-huh. Yeah, no, he's really sharp. I don't know much about his family, honestly. I saw on Instagram he was hanging out with them a little while ago, but I don't know. I don't know much about his family. Oh, one thing. Okay, here's one thing that I do know about him when he was young. So at the beginning of Prince of Cats, Tybalt like to introduce the characters. He's got two characters, Samson and Gregory. They're like playing dice, and then Tybalt. They're like, oh, Tybalt's coming home today. Tybalt shows up, and they start making fun of him because he had been away at private school, and so they're making fun of him like he came back and he's like acting fancy and has lost his street cred because he went off to private school, and that's a direct reference to Ronald's own biography. Like he was away at private school for a time, and then when he came back, he felt like some sort of like separation from other folks that he knew in the neighborhood. CXC is, let me give you the correct dates. It's October. So his public talk here at the museum is part of CXC. So that's going to start Thursday, October 13th through the 16th. But if you Google CXC or Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, and there's a website that's got the full schedule and all of the artists that are coming. Yeah. It's good. It's a really, really, really good lineup of special guests, and it's impressive that we've got the pull now with Jeff Smith and Lucy Caswell and Tom Spurgeon. Especially those three, like they've got the pull to bring in a lot of really famous cartoonists to be part of CXC for its first full year. Like it's been really impressive to see that list come together. Yeah, back there. It'll be in here. Yeah. Yes, with it being part of CXC, we're expecting a big crowd. Yeah, so that same day at noon, it's a conversation between two artists. One is he just goes by the name Seth. He's a Canadian cartoonist. And the other artist is Ben Katchor, Katchor. We're going to have CXC. Yeah, we're going to have some CXC promotional stuff. Yeah, so there's the poetry remix connector, where visitors will be mixing the Shakespeare lines with rap lyrics, and then there's a connector associated with that comic Lighten Up, the one about the editorial racism, so when we installed that, we did all 26 panels in a line, so you could read it, from left to right. And then we're reproducing some of the internet comments that appeared in the discussions about the comic. We've got those on the wall, and then we've got to join the conversation where visitors can make their own comments or ask their own questions about the issues raised by the comic. Mm-hmm. No, I think they're still doing that. That's a different. So that the Billy Ireland thing is really like an academic conference, and then CXC's there's a portion of CXC that's kind of the academic conference thing, but then the bulk of it is more of this artist showcase and artist panel discussions and interviews and things like that.
But explain that it's not Comic-Con.
Yeah. Yeah, I went over that. So you're not gonna see like people dressed up in superhero costumes or anything like that. And I'll tell you the thing that's cool. Okay, so with well, never mind. No, I won't get into that. That's fine. But CXC, the pilot program that they did last year, it took place at the Cultural Arts Center and was a huge success. It's got a great vibe, and it's the kind of thing where, like, I ran into somebody that I knew from working here. He's a graphic designer. I ran into him, and I was like, oh, cool, I didn't know you were into comics. He says, I'm not into comics. I'm a graphic designer, but I heard this was, like, would be cool for a graphic designer to see. And I was like, yeah, you're on point. That's exactly right. Like, it's not for, you don't have to be a comics fan to really get a lot out of CXC, because it's not about nerd culture, or geek culture. It's just about, the art form itself. That's good. All right. Anybody else? Cool. Well, thanks. real problem with it is, and then also we can give people an opportunity to share that. So
This is art. That's why I did it. This is art. It's a chance to learn, practice. So I didn't mention it.
oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Not knowing if I knew I would explain.
Well, I would be open to you know if we gave people an opportunity to say you know if we had like a